I think there are always those surprising recollection moments in the career as you're looking back, and the how did I get here moment. I think the biggest one was my first trip into Baghdad on a C-130. They don't tell you this, but you're flying in at night, and then in order to be as safe as possible, you get over the airport and essentially go into a nosedive to land. And I kind of had this moment of, man, life in Western Massachusetts was pretty nice. How did I find myself in a nosedive over Iraq?
Welcome to Tough Tech Today with Mayan and Miller. This is the premier show featuring trailblazers who are building technologies today to solve tomorrow's toughest challenges.
Well, welcome to Tough Tech Today with Mayan and Miller. Today, we have the honor of having Orin Hoffman, venture partner at MIT's The Engine Investment Group. Orin has quite the background in product development, specifically in robotics. So, for example, he was a chief technologist at Endeavor Robotics, which itself was a spin-out from his work at iRobot. And so, with that, welcome, Orin.
Thanks. Great to be here, guys.
Elaborate a bit on who you are and what you've been working on lately.
Yeah, one of those. I was just thinking about before the show the weird career arcs that we take. So I think it's important to start a little bit earlier than maybe some guests. So I went to school in Western Massachusetts and was a typical Western Massachusetts hippie. Had hair down to my waist and was working at Mount Holyoke teaching after college, and I ended up getting recruited to join a company that was kind of pre its growth stage in Boston, iRobot, which for a roboticist was a pretty cool opportunity. So moved to Boston and started working at iRobot. iRobot at the time was really kind of an R&D house doing a bunch of SBIRs and DARPA programs and things like that, but just kind of sussing out different areas of product that robot technology could be applied to. And then 9/11 happened and the conflicts emerged, and it was a weird time when you think of a dual-use company because essentially almost simultaneously there was this huge demand to figure out a way to rapidly translate all of these kind of DARPA research robots into this needed element to protect our warfighters abroad, which was the improvised explosive device threat. And then at the same time, some of our government research had lent itself in a funny roundabout way to the Roomba vacuum cleaner, where, and this is true, and a lot of people don't know this, the actual original cleaning algorithm of the Roomba was based on a DARPA minesweeping project algorithm. So it turned out that to optimize the clearing of a minefield was a very similar algorithm to the optimizing the floor coverage of a room. And for floor vacuum cleaners, battery to coverage is always the trick. And so that kind of Roomba product was in its early infancy and was starting to take off. And I went towards the government and industrial side of the house and just entered this amazing moment in history for an engineer where we were essentially being asked by the government to take these total prototypes and turn them into reliable, rugged, small to large scale robotic systems that we could send out into harm's way so that our warfighters didn't have to go walk down a street to disarm a bomb. And I spent the next 8 years responding to kind of these requirements overseas, and in so doing, somehow found myself in these product development cycles of, around every 6 to 8 months, we would have to design a new robot system. And I ended up deploying overseas to Iraq and Afghanistan on 7 occasions to actually train and learn in the field how the robots were performing. And so for me, it was an amazingly satisfying period of my career because, it's actually kind of seeing the impact of your engineering save actual lives. And that was sort of when I fell in love with tough tech, because I was seeing, these super high tech devices actually have a real world, super impactful result. And then we spun out Endeavor Robotics once a little bit after iRobot went public for a number of reasons. And Endeavor Robotics was later acquired by one of the defense primes, FLIR Systems. And around that time, I got tapped to join a early innovation cell within the government, Defense Innovation Unit Experimental, which was stood up by Ash Carter, who is a longtime friend of Tough Tech and has similar frustrations as the engine has around why Tough Tech doesn't turn into real commercial companies for our national industrial base, and how we can better get government to collaborate with non-traditional companies and private capital. And so for 3 years, I worked on the front lines of creative government contracting and reducing friction for non-traditional companies to work with government, which was a natural kind of flow into my job at the Engine, which as a venture partner working with the investment team on investing in founders and tough tech startups. And I also run the Engine's government practice to continue pushing forward with our government partners on how to fund the various valleys of death that our companies see.
Wow, what a journey!
Yeah, and that sure sounds like it's one thing has led to another on a very specialized path. Did it look like that on the past you? Was this something that it was like I want to be in this position, or that in some ways it kind of evolved to be the case?
Well, I think there are always those surprising recollection moments in the career as you're looking back, and the how did I get here moment. I think the biggest one was my first trip into Baghdad on a C-130. They don't tell you this, but you're flying in at night, and then in order to be as safe as possible, you get over the airport and essentially go into a nosedive to land. And I kind of had this moment of, man, life in Western Massachusetts was like pretty nice. How did I find myself in a nosedive over Iraq landing? But I think to your point, where I am now, as I look back, it just seems like such a natural fit in retrospect, but certainly couldn't have predicted it.
So you mentioned some of the the frustrations of working with the government for a tough tech company. Can you kind of elaborate on what those frustrations are?
Oh, wow. So, I think what I will say first and foremost is that there are a lot of folks in government right now that recognize kind of the two important things. One, from a U.S. perspective, obviously there's a whole conversation around China and the new economy or Industry 4.0 and where we sit in global competitiveness. And there are kind of obvious gaps to how we're supporting our national industrial base, both from a private capital and public capital perspective. And I think there's also a recognition that there is an emerging mass of global problems, COVID being, an obvious example of where our lack of infrastructure and a national industrial base that can respond to global problems is increasingly debilitating at the global scale. And so, the thing that I love most about the Engine and the Engine's mission is we are taking a swing at these tremendous global problems that are incredibly difficult to run through the full life cycle of the company. But, if successful, these will be the foundational companies of tomorrow. And so that's an incredibly exciting mission to be on. And one piece of our kind of thesis as the Engine was looking to get stood up is that, pure venture capital is necessary but not sufficient for these tough tech companies. There is a network around these companies that has to exist that involves academia, it involves corporate partners, it involves different types of financing through what we call the capital stack, especially as we look to later stage. And then there's a critical component of the government, both at the early stage and at later stages when these massive swing companies are looking to scale up. So where we see the two kind of biggest gaps in government funding right now is that traditional government funding tends to support either companies that are going to be focused purely on government issues, and DoD being the largest kind of SBIR budget, it's generally on DoD issues. And then kind of what I would call service provider type companies, and both of those types of companies have a incredibly important role to play in our national industrial base. But the gap that's left there is that current government allocation of capital is kind of being done in a vacuum to private capital where it's not coordinated. So a big part of what the work that we and our partners are doing is trying to remove friction for these tough tech companies that need a combination of public and private capital. And there's a lot of kind of creative programs going on within the government. And I just want to take a moment to tip my hat to the folks in government right now who I left behind, who are still fighting the good fight. And it is incredibly hard, incredibly frustrating. And it is such a necessary thing. And I think we're seeing some really exciting results in these innovation programs that we're seeing emerge over the last couple of years.
I have a question that you mentioned about the capital stack, and access to capital is something that so many tough tech entrepreneurs are either facing or maybe haven't realized yet that can definitely be a crunch for them throughout various phases of the company's life. So could you clarify on like the trusted capital network and the role that group may play, if any, on part of this for the tough tech entrepreneur?
Yeah, so there are a couple of initiatives within government to collect a network of private capital that is trusted capital. I think you're referencing the Trusted Capital Marketplace, but there's also DARPA's Investor Working Group and several other networks of investors. And the government's motivation there is just, frankly, to make sure that they're pushing companies to collaborate with investors that come with, I'll just call it clean money, and the right motivations.
Could you elaborate a bit on what that means, the clean money and right motivations?
Yeah, there's been a lot of study around kind of IP theft and foreign ownership. And so I think depending on what kind of work the company is getting into, there's kind of different levels of safe capital or trusted capital that a company needs to watch out for. And I think the government is frustrated that organizations like CFIUS always have to go in with the stick and fix problems that happened. The things like the Trusted Capital Marketplace are trying to get ahead of that. And it's good to assemble those cadres of investors. The engine is certainly one of them, but that the organization of investors is kind of step one. What the government's next step needs to be is figure out how to incentivize those investors to invest in companies that are of national strategic value for our national industrial base and national security industrial base. And then, as a benefit to the government can then leverage the extreme multiplication that having, leveraging private capital gives to the government, as well as giving the government early access to these companies. And only goodness happens when you create a community of government and corporate and academics around these companies. Because to my earlier point, for these companies to be successful, they need that community of all those stakeholders.
And now, is most of the work to try to push towards that, is that happening from within the government organizations, or is there legislation pending that might assist with partnering with private capital?
Yeah, so there's some interesting programs going on. The DOE and NSF and Army and AFWorks is definitely leading the way on a lot of these matching grant programs, which I think is a great first step. AFWorks is generally focused a little bit later stage, but it would be great to stand up some of these matching grant programs at the seed stage to more effectively pull these breakthrough technologies out of universities, whether through the STTR or SBIR program or whatnot. But I think that at some point there is a policy restriction on the way that the government needs to interact with these companies. The government generally does not like to choose winners. It does not like to push chips in. It kind of smears risk around just by nature. and spread money around. And there are for tough tech companies that are so capital intensive and have such a long runway, we're not going to build the first global fusion reactor based on stacking up a bunch of SBIRs. We're not going to build grid level energy storage that way. So it's at some point we need to open up both early and later stage capitals to support these companies. So there is legislation, things like the Endless Frontier Act, I think are positive moves. I think there's some reform of the SBIR and SBIC programs to kind of further incentivize and enable these really dedicated program managers to have more flexibility in how they interact with these companies and with the private capital markets.
When with the considerations around the government environment that a lot of these, it sounds like a lot of the companies that you work with must interact, how does that influence the way that you go about sort of developing an investment thesis on behalf of the engine to figure out which areas of technology could be really interesting, and then furthermore, then sort of hunting for the whales, looking for the really great teams that are exploring those areas?
I think it's probably time for an anecdote, just to kind of bring things down to tangible. I think it's traditionally VCs are a little bit wary of government investment in companies or companies whose kind of plan is to go after research and development contracts and whatnot. But where we've seen it really work is where the government aligns the commercial growth of a company and support of that commercial growth that also meets government product requirements. So you can call that dual use, you call it just good business, but that to an investor is extremely appealing. And so I'll just give one example from one of our portfolio companies, Analytical Space. They had a series of initial kind of early stage contracts with the Air Force, and that kind of helped on, combined with the engine and investment, helped kind of push their product roadmap and develop as a company. But then where it got really exciting is they were selected for the Air Force's Strat-Fi program, which is a very significant matching grant. I don't know if I can disclose the number, but it's in the tens of millions of dollars. And what that Strat-Fi contract does for a company like ASI is it enables them to essentially go out to investors and say, look, we've established this public-private partnership with the Air Force where they are going to fund a significant portion of the initial capital expenses of putting these satellites up in space. And in return for that, they're going to be a customer for our data, but we've done the technical homework to make sure that we can interoperate with government assets as well as with commercial assets. So we can also go after these commercial data markets. And so what that means to an investor is man, I'm now leveraging this public dollars with my private dollars to create significant leverage on my dollars, and I have a government partner who is extremely competent at launching and testing space systems, and so there's goodness sort of across the board in those kind of public-private partnerships. And so I think that it's always hard to predict, and I don't want to put overt pressure on the particular company, but I think that this moment is going to launch them in a growth cycle that was far higher than they would be without this public-private partnership. And I didn't mean to use launch as a pun, but it's fair enough.
And you said that was the Strat-Fi program?
Strat-Fi, yeah. So the AFWorks has taken an interesting tact on kind of dividing up what they call small bets, mid-sized bets, and big bets. And so the small bets are sort of the early stage SBIRs, and there's some mid-sized bets in the couple $100,000 to couple million. And then they want to make a couple of small bets or a couple of large bets on kind of big swings that they recognized couldn't exist with just private capital and couldn't have a market growth opportunity without public capital. And so ASI was selected for that program because there was a clear dual use application for their technology. And so that's just super exciting. And it's how public-private partnerships should work. We got to come up with a name that's not public-private partnerships, because I feel like I'm doing Peter Piper every time I say it.
You're doing well with it, though. With the now I'm give me a
see, there you go.
with the public-private partnerships, as a coming from the venture capital point of view, have you found that you or your colleagues would view that kind of the public work as non-recurring revenue, and thus it may not there may be a strategic value, but not necessarily like wow, this is on the path to IPO because of the amount of money being made. That StratFi may have given tens of millions of dollars, but that was kind of like a one-time opportunity.
Yeah, that's a great question. So you definitely, when dealing with government, need to separate what is either research and development funds or NRE funds that push you along your product roadmap. That for us, fundamentally, for a dual-use company, having government as an end customer is great, but you need to be commercially successful first and foremost. So any government money that comes in that is distracting from that commercial roadmap is bad money. But so you need to separate the NRE and research and development dollars from government as a customer, which is a whole other bag of contracting worms and competing with defense primes and whatnot. But part of the value of things like the StratFi is that not only did it provide the NRE to get these satellites up in orbit, which would be challenging to do piecemeal with venture capital dollars, but it also set up the Air Force to be a recurring data as a service customer, as well as open up the door to other government customers. And so I think you can sell to the government in more of a commercial way than just doing the typical program of records and compete with defense primes on a battlefield that you're probably not going to win if you just look at the statistics.
So could you talk a little bit more about, what you do at the engine for companies that might be interested in, pitching to the engine, what stage you're looking at, and what type of companies you're really looking to invest in?
Yeah, so the engine is it's many things, but it's kind of three things. We are a venture capital fund. We do have patient capital, so it's a longer fund life than traditional venture capital. But we are a for-profit fund because we believe that in order to make these companies scale and be globally impactful and globally scalable, they have to make money. So we have to make sure that we're taking the biggest swings we can and doing the hard work of figuring out how to make these companies both impactfully successful as well as financially successful. And so that's kind of the fun side. But then there are other, in order to make these companies successful and reduce some of the friction that tough tech companies have historically found, we provide infrastructure. So that's lab space, wet labs, chem labs, biolabs, et cetera, as well as working space. Because one of the huge points of frictions for breakout technologies out of universities is, it's very hard as a 3 to 4 person startup to buy millions of dollars of capital equipment right out of the gate. So giving companies a couple of years of space to figure out who they are as a company, what their exact product roadmap, and then what their capital and lab space needs are moving forward. It was a hugely critical part of the engine. We're super excited that we have our place in Central Square, and in a couple of years we'll be opening up what we call our 10X space, which is several 100,000 square feet with many hundreds of entrepreneurs. It's going to be Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory of tough tech, and it's going to be just this incredible place to walk around and just see the world change in front of your eyes. And then the third piece of the engine is what we call the network, which I referenced earlier, which is the need to surround oftentimes first-time founders, oftentimes technical founders, with other founders, with other like-minded investors, with academia partners, with government partners, with corporate partners, And in so doing, we create kind of a network effect amongst the tough tech community. And it really is amazing to just watch how, a founder in a energy company could be going through the same issues as a founder from a totally separate, biotech company. The challenges that founders face in tough tech are oftentimes startlingly similar, regardless of the space that they're in. You asked what kind of companies we look at. Tough tech is the term that we use. That we don't like to artificially bin companies, but generally speaking, we look at kind of three categories: companies that are involved in combating climate change. So that's where most of our energy portfolio companies go, as well as industrial companies, and really exciting space. Human health, which we're not investing in drug development or pharmaceuticals. Really looking at exciting platform technologies. Whether it's how to use AI and lasers to build human tissue, just incredibly exciting, game-changing biotech. And then computing of tomorrow, which is things like quantum computing software and photonics and autonomous driving, and just the kind of exciting component technologies that will have a significant effect on as we look at sort of advanced systems and what computing of tomorrow is going to look like.
You cover a large variety of topics, and on the entrepreneur side, it may be the case that the problems I face in energy may also have comparable issues like of a founder that's in robotics. But then on the investor side, these are very different technical domains. So how do you get smart on a new topic that may be of future sort of frontier investment interest?
It's a great question. So we I guess first and foremost, we don't ever believe that we're experts in the fields that the founders are coming to us with. If we are, probably not the right investment, because even if a robotics company crosses the door, I'm 3 years, 4 years out of being a roboticist, and so it's actually oftentimes harder to view things where you have some expertise in, because you kind of know enough to be dangerous. I think, we do technical diligence on the companies. We have experts and academic colleagues and government lab scientists that we pull in to, certainly do a healthy technical diligence. But at the stage that our companies are in, a big part of what we look at is, the team, is the founder, the founding team, do they have, the technical chops, the plan, the people that they're going to bring in, as well as the breakthrough technology in order to create this kind of globally changing company. And so we try to, at the same time, it's, as with any investment, you're balancing kind of your tolerance for risk, technical risk, with kind of your belief in the impact that this company could have. And I think it's important to lean into the fact that if anything is a sure thing, it's probably not tough tech, and we shouldn't be involved in it. So, we're taking big swings here, and so there's always going to be a lot of risk, and you just want to see a team that you believe can not just break through the one wall, but the 10, 20 different walls that they're going to have to break through in the time it's going to take them to really grow into the company that they want to be.
And you mentioned your patient capital. What does actually that mean? Like, what's the scope of that? 10 years, 20 years? Are you making 100-year bets?
So timeline is always complicated. So it's up to an 18-year investing timeline. But I would stress that when we think about timelines for these companies, it may take quite a long time for, to create the next, GE of the US or the next, foundational company. And so, we spend a lot of time thinking about not just our investment today, where we're, early stage seed round, Series A round investors, but also what is their full capital stack going to look like in order to reach the ambition that they're laying out. And, we spend quite a bit of time working with other financial partners to figure out, can we fill those gaps with the mechanisms we have today, or do we have to go find the partners and figure out a way to fill those gaps? And I think that is a really exciting part of the job, because figuring out, how companies can go from, a relatively small seed check to building a, $200 million first of its kind plant at doing something is, these are not typical invest in software and flip it in 2 years for whatever it is. And, I think that's a really exciting part of our mission here.
So it goes back to some of your earlier days when you were a software engineer, fresh-faced, I guess, I presume, like out of college, software engineer at iRobot, which I'm sure was probably an exciting gig for you. And now, how did you start to move toward this interest on the business side of things, where you are now on as venture capital, I guess, is technically a part of financial services. So how'd that happen?
Yeah, it's great. So I took a detour through government on my way there, and I think that was sort of the thing that kind of flipped in my head. The most satisfying part of my career, as I said, was that feeling that the technology that you were developing was having an impact and quite literally saving human life. And that was kind of one widget saving one person. And as I went into government and I saw these companies that were attacking kind of larger problems, but it still had that same feeling of, if we can apply this technology and actually build a company around it, you can have effect on not just one person, but on the entire world, right? And so I guess as I got older, it just moving into an investment role just felt like, given my experience in government, that I had something to bring to the table, and my experience as an operator within a tough tech company, and that this is a way that I can just in any small way help push these kind of more global swings, and that's just an amazing part of being at the engine and just feeling that energy around that mission every day that we used to go into work.
Everybody wants to know, or at least me, is have you chosen to keep up the coding skills since you're 3 years out of the robotics land? Yeah,
there comes a moment, whether you're an individual contributor to a company and you go up through the management track, or in my case, went off to government, and you have this moment where you look back and you're like, man, I haven't booted into Linux in like 2 years. And then your laptop breaks and you buy another one and you don't even bother to install it. And then you're like, okay, that was it. But I do help my nephew do STEM type robotics, and I still try to do some STEM workshops when I have the time. So give me a Lego Mindstorm and I can still, throw a couple things together. Awesome. But my coding days are sadly over of anything more advanced than that.
What do you see as the area of tough tech that you're most excited about right now? Something that you think is going to have the big breakthrough that, if the United States can seize it and create a company around it, could really increase our standing in the world?
It's not an individual company, but I think all of us have gone through a time of reflection during this kind of COVID epoch, and one of the things that I I experienced deeply in government working with the DoD is, there is certainly a very real global competitiveness state of affairs, especially with China, and kind of where we're going to be able to economically and militarily compete. And I think there is, if that motivates the government and the citizenry to push tough tech companies farther along, then I think that's a great motivation. But I'm also motivated by these changing trends in a world and making sure that we figure out ways to apply technology and capital to equity. And so when I think about what has happened, just looking at the US and the offshoring, the drying up of low and mid-wage jobs, I think that there is a scenario in which we can make investments into enabling technologies and companies that will enable us to pull some of these industries that have basically shuttered in the US or in the process of shuttering or offshoring back into the US and offer not just high-tech jobs, but also jobs for the whole population. And I think, when you look at companies like Boston Metal, which is a distributed metal manufacturing technology that has the capacity to totally revolutionize the industry and also provide amazing industry jobs to a cadre of people that are, I think we all are concerned that are being left out of the economic growth that some of the country is seeing. And we have a lot of companies that are in that arena via separations, Syzygy, the list goes on and on. But I think that trend is something that I would very much like to lean into as we kind of do this introspection around COVID and look at what's on the other side for this economic recovery that needs to happen.
Are there some fundamentals that you may have seen that an engineer or business person working on a frontier technology, trying to commercialize it, some fundamentals that would translate beyond just in the United States for the many folks that are working on tough technologies outside the U.S.?
So are you asking to contrast like kind of what China's strategy to develop their national industrial bases vice the U.S. strategy, or more at the entrepreneurial level?
More on the entrepreneurial level for now is, for example, if we have a team that's, whether they're based in, say, in the UK or in a part of Africa, what are there some fundamentals that you've seen that where, because they're not necessarily part or easily looped into some of the specialness of the U.S. ecosystem, or especially like the Cambridge-Boston ecosystem?
So that's a great question, and I actually think if there was I think one of the benefits that we've seen as we've all tried to figure out what work is like in the time of COVID is, right now capital is essentially spread to a couple of different focus areas: Boston, New York, Austin, Silicon Valley, et cetera. And it leaves a lot of potentially innovative hubs in the US and around the world in the cold from a capital perspective. And one of the things that we've seen that has actually been heartening with this distributed online workforce is companies that historically would only hire locally, which kind of keeps these high-tech jobs either brain draining from the Midwest or just leaves folks out of the ability to participate in that part of the economy. There's been this willingness to open the aperture to run the experiment of having a more distributed workforce. And I think what they've found is that they've found talent in places that they didn't suspect were there and that have been incredibly useful. And that's not just in underrepresented places in the US, but also globally.
So then we may see over the next several years during the mid-COVID and eventually a post-COVID new normal, that aspirationally that there may be more variety of choices of where someone can choose to work on this kind of technology, and it's not going to be just in some of the main capital investment capitals.
Yeah, I think that would be a terrific outcome. I mean, there's a pretty significant disparity in access to capital, and hopefully these workforce evolutions, as well as some of the efforts like in the Endless Frontier Act of creating regional innovation hubs in underrepresented areas can help kind of diversify that access to capital. Because I think if there's one thing that is kind of a truism in the startup community is that, obviously it's impossible to predict which founders are going to be successful or not. Otherwise, there'd be no such thing as VC. And I think there are a lot of different types of founders out there that could work on a lot of different types of companies. And I think the more that we can open the door to those types of founders, especially underrepresented founders, I think that is part of our mission at the Engine as well.
Now, how much does that distributedness of the new workforce affect tough tech companies, though? Because one thing that you mentioned as a resource that the Engine provides is, these lab spaces and these expensive machines. And so there's still going to be a very centralized aspect to at least the work that you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at some level, when you got to run a centrifuge, you got to be in front of a centrifuge. But I do think that there are, especially when we look at kind of increase in these regional hubs, and one of the things that we try to do at the Engine from an infrastructure perspective is not just provide organic infrastructure from the Engine, but also to partner with all of the amazing infrastructure that's in the Boston area. So, there's a supercomputer in Western Mass, and, Natick Labs has certain capital-intensive equipment, and MIT Lincoln Labs has an amazing foundry. And so to create a frictionless way for our founders to be able to collaborate with both that equipment as well as with the research scientists in those locations has been a big effort for us over the last couple of years. And I think, we'll see how it goes, but I think that could be expanded on a geographically diversified basis.
So in the long term, you're saying the Engine might also be focusing, like, how much do you focus on investments around Massachusetts and around Cambridge? Are you kind of expanding your focus to be more nationally?
Well, I think it should be noted that the Engine fundamentally is a great stacking up of different experiments on how to best support the tough tech ecosystem in the U.S. and globally. And so in the first couple of years of the Engine, it was very important to have this kind of cohort, mostly local model. We've done some experimental investments in companies outside of, I shouldn't say experimental investments. We've done some investments as an experiment outside of Boston. We have a company in Oakland and a company in Houston, and those have been working out great. And so we'll see how the Engine evolves over time.
What's your perspective on what we might call a non-tough tech company, TikTok, and some of the issues that have emerged from that, where there's a focus on the algorithms and the opportunities or dangers of having perception and psychology influenced by what's shown to individuals en masse?
Yeah, I'm gonna punt on that. I have too much on my plate to deal with the TikTok drama, so tough tech is hard enough.
Because that does come down to things like CFIUS, right, and some of the nation state issues that we come up against on tough tech, but now on a more consumer oriented play. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's definitely rocked the consumer world. But I will say just on CFIUS and ITAR restrictions in general that we really need to move as a national strategy from, again, this just sort of stick approach to preventing companies from growing through foreign capital and things like that, to adding a carrot where if we declared a national strategy to unwind a deal, then there needs to be some way that the government is providing an opportunity for those companies to grow. And right now, that's not really a seamlessly and frictionlessly running system. And so it is my hope that as we look at and who knows what happens in the next administration, but as we look at significant infrastructure investments being budgeted for in Congress right now, is my hope that significant dollars are being set aside for these tough tech categories that will move the needle, not just for the companies, but for, as I mentioned, across the board employment, and will allow these companies to stay in the U.S. and not go overseas, whether they're going overseas to get capital or to, cheaper labor or whatever it is. And so, I think that there is an investment in tough tech that is yet to come, and the CFIUS problem is just sort of the tip of the iceberg of that.
If you were then like king for the day, how might you go about changing to add some of that incentives to better align the whole sort of marketplace or industry?
Are you authorized to make me king for the day? I'll take the swing.
Well, yeah. Where's my little Burger King?
Well, I will just lay out two sort of tactical but sweeping policy recommendations that we're actually working on now. So it's a timely question, and it is kind of goes to how the government supports both early stage and later stage valleys of death. In the early stage, one kind of fundamental assumption for tough tech, as I mentioned, is that it requires a lot of diverse types of capital, of which government putting capital in a vacuum has historically not been that effective in pushing tough tech companies forward, given tough tech company capital requirements. And the venture capital community, likewise, has not been as effective as it needs to be in investing in these companies in the early stage. So figuring out a way to create a pretty significant consortium of money and entrepreneurs, whether it's $500 million or $1 billion, in order to essentially match up entrepreneurs that get investment of private capital that then, much like AFWorks is doing with their later stage matching grants, where these companies get matching dollars from the government, which kind of avoids them having to spend a bunch of time applying to different kind of low probability win SBIRs and whatnot. So really to incentivize both government and private capital to work together at the early stage. So I think there's a small fund of that would be great to see Congress push through and to provide the policy leniency for the government to be able to execute on that kind of a vision. And then really importantly, in the later stage, as we're looking for first of its kind, these are companies whose pilot projects, the N equals 1, don't currently have a natural fit in the capital stack. So, once you've built your third plant and you've proven the revenue model and whatnot, you're eligible for project finance and debt and sort of other kind of traditional financial structures. But if you're building a $100, $200 million first of its kind plant, it's hard to get traditional finance for that. And so things like the DOE Loan Program Office have been historically stood up to help reduce friction in those. And so I think one of our recommendations is for a more national tough tech loan program office to be stood up, so that across the board for these big swing companies, there is a way for the government to help back finance that goes to these first of a kind projects. So those are my two king for the day policy swings.
Well, now that you're on the wide audience of Tough Tech Today, people will hear those and probably make it happen, right?
Yes, make it so. Call your Congress people.
Well, we're getting to the end of the time slot, so we just wanted to give you a moment if you had any last things to say to our audience, especially anyone that's aspiring to found a tough tech company, or maybe has an idea and a technology that they're trying to commercialize. What advice would you have for them?
Yeah, come talk to us. I mean, I think one of the things that we really lean into is spending time with potential founders and entrepreneurs. I mean, it is a fundamental core part of our mission to be in various academic and government labs, and for folks that have maybe even never considered the entrepreneurial path, just to kind of help mentor, work with programs like ITAR and Activate and programs like that, and the innovation. The MIT has several great programs, but I think there's a historical misidentification that technical founders need to go find an MBA or whatnot, and that is not something that we lean into. So we encourage you, if you are a technical founder that isn't sure exactly what their idea is, and but just kind of wants to explore taking a swing at whether your piece of breakthrough technology is commercializable, please reach out. We have a link on our website where you can just sort of put a couple of sentences in on your idea, and we will talk to you, because it is the best part of our job is, talking to early stage potential entrepreneurs and in the hopes that we can, make an investment in them and in their dream. And so talk to us earlier rather than later, I think, would be my message to entrepreneurs that are thinking about it.
Awesome. Thank you very much. We'll make sure we put that link in the description of the video and the podcast, so people can check that out.
Awesome. Well, it's great spending the hour with you guys. Thank you for what you guys are doing. I think it's I really enjoyed the podcast so far. Hopefully your blooper reel on me is the first of a long reel, but appreciate the time.
Public-private placement. Let's do it. Right?
There we go. Had to wait till the end to get it.
Yeah, I had to really think about it and concentrate. So, well, thank you so much, Orin. We really appreciate having you on the show.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Tough Tech Today. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a 5-star review on any podcast app, or give a thumbs up and subscribe on YouTube. Next week, we'll be sitting down with Mazdak of Trace Matters, and we'll be discussing how he got his mass spectrometer company off the ground. Thanks again, and stay tough.